My first two videos on my channel are about how reducing historical analysis to simple moral arcs and hasty generalizations damages actual intellectual analysis and discussion surrounding history. Imagine for a second if Whig history and Reddit had a child that was ran over by a car 2 times. This child would eventually grow up to be known as pop history. Greetings and salutations, I am Arocion, and this is my issue with historically. Sometimes people would like to express their interest in history through memes or by engaging with it in a less serious manner. That's completely fine. Not every historical discussion has to be dry and overly academic. Humor has a place and memes can be a fun way to engage with the subject. The issue is that for many people, their understanding of history is already shallow and incomplete. Because of this, jokes and memes often reinforce incorrect ideas rather than harmlessly playing off well-understood facts. Over time, people begin repeating these misconceptions as if they were gospel. An example of this is the claim that the Austro-Hungarian army was simply ineffective because it spoke multiple languages and had multiple ethnicities, despite that explanation being largely inaccurate. What makes this claim particularly amusing to me is that this is rarely, if ever, brought up in discussions about previous wars that the Austro-Hungarians fought. In places like Reddit, constant repostings of these ideas further reinforces them, until they start being treated as fact. After all, if enough people repeat something and there's an image attached to it, it is a fact. But no conflict has more misconceptions than World War II, and pop historians adore this topic. A pop historian's goal is to cover the topic with a kind of moral agenda, where their goal is to make the Nazis seem like moronic, heckin' racists, and the people who let Hitler take all that land through appeasement are actually stupid pacifists, who are letting the bad guy become strong. One such victim of this kind of flanderization of history is Dutch YouTuber and game designer Historically, who I watch from time to time. I found his video on Chamberlain and Hitler to be poorly studied. I don't necessarily think Historically is stupid or anything, I just find some of his points kind of ridiculous, and I felt like he rushed this out to establish a moral position. Which doesn't make sense now, but later in the video you'll see what I mean when I say this. The video follows Historically playing the judge of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Chamberlain, deciding how honest they were in their speeches and if their actions hold up to what they sold to their followers. The dictators are pop historians' favorite characters to cover, as it's extremely easy to criticize their character, and it's hard to explain the context of their actions without seeming like you're trying to justify them. So, what a lot of pop historians do is they make hasty moral narratives about these dictators that they cover in their history. However, Historically took this a step further with Chamberlain and basically outright lied, which is what eventually provoked this response video to begin with. So, let's explore what Historically got wrong about World War II.
You gave the Reichstag speech. Freedom and the future of the German nation. That's not really accurate. In 1940, Germany was indeed fighting for its freedom, because it actually had thrown that freedom away by starting the wars with European nations. By that time, your Germany had already invaded Poland and a bunch of other European countries, not to mention just annexed others. The idea that Germany was in a struggle for freedom comes across here as a justification for the war effort.
As shown in the clip, Hitler claimed in his 1940s Reichstag speech that he was fighting for freedom. The critique presented is that this is hypocritical, begging the question, how could somebody claim to fight for Germany's freedom while stripping away its neighbor's freedom and endanger itself? The issue with Historically's critique, however, ignores the role of rhetoric, especially the rhetoric of a demagogue, which makes Historically look very pedantic in my opinion. When politicians give speeches, particularly demagogues, they're not using words like freedom or liberty in their precise or consistent sense. They're using them as persuasive tools. In fact, one of the clearest ways to identify a demagogue is through their language. When a politician uses terms like freedom or liberty loosely and repeatedly, they are often trying to sell a movement. These words become emotional triggers, playing on the fact that most people are incapable of noticing they're actually being lied to. The devil sells you freedom to enslave you in sin, as some might say. So it's more useful to ask, what did Hitler actually mean by freedom here? For that, the January 1939 Reichstag speech provides important context. In it, Hitler portrays the global conflict in ideological terms, portraying threats like Bolshevism as existential dangers and invoking conspiratorial enemies. His language consistently postures Germany, and by extension itself, as a defender of civilization against these forces. Viewed through this lens, freedom is not in the conventional sense. Instead, it refers to liberation from ideological enemies, control over internal narratives, and protection against external threats like Bolshevism. In his own framework, expansion and war can be seen as acts of liberation rather than domination. This is why he often viewed himself as a liberator, even while engaging in aggressive conquest. Ideologically, he believed he was securing freedom for Germany, as well as, in accordance to his own definitions, the freedoms of others. However, we should examine the claims more pragmatically. Whatever his stated intentions and beliefs are, the practical outcome of his decisions, practically his poor strategic planning of the war, ultimately led to Germany to be placed back in the shackles Hitler attempted to free himself from.
Hold on, that's not quite right. He violated the Versailles Treaty by rearming in 1935, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, annexing Austria in 1938, and seizing Czechoslovakia in 1939. All before the war. It definitely revisions the treaty, but none were peaceful means.
The conditions imposed at Versailles were intolerable.
You are right that a lot of Germans felt that way. What you say matters to the current now. Because while the treaty wasn't popular, it didn't force Germany into dictatorship or another war. Germany's reparations had already been reduced by the Dawes Plan in 1924 and Young Plan in 1929, and cancelled entirely in 1932 at the Lausanne Conference. Germany's economy was recovering.
So, the prior point was pedantic, however, it's in this clip where I felt like historically started moral posturing. To begin, there's the criticism of Germany breaking the Treaty of Versailles. In the clip, it's framed as aggressive and unnecessary. However, I'll give historically credit for bringing up the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, and Lausanne Conference. It is more than what most discussions of the interwar period can manage. However, the conclusions drawn from them are questionable and end up biting him in the ass. Criticism of aggression starts off by claiming Germany building up its military and rearming the Rhineland was an aggressive act. This take was so outrageous, the first time I watched it, I jumped out of my chair and had to do a double take. Armament, in of itself, is not inherently aggressive. States generally have the right to build up their militaries and fortify their own territories. In that sense, Germany, rebuilding its armed forces and remilitarizing areas like the Rhineland is a sovereign act. Granted, it would be a diplomatic outrage for some, as it did break the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties, but it's still in Germany's sovereignty to do so. Keep in mind, you can criticize Hitler's steps to break the military restrictions set in Versailles as aggressive, through Anschluss, or even what happened in Czechoslovakia, which I would say fair play to you. I personally wouldn't call the former aggressive, but the argument can be made. Hitler, in the same speech, said he'd prefer the process of breaking the treaty as, so far as possible, this is to be done by peaceful means. Now we have to address historically claims of redundancy. So Hitler would famously go on long speeches about Versailles' economic pressure on Germany, with historically criticizing it as digging up old wounds. He felt that they were resolved prior and didn't need to be brought up. Before discussing the Dawes Plan, the Young's Plan, and the Lausanne Conference, let's examine your average German for a second. You were hit by a massive economic crash. You might have even ended up in another country like Poland or France. Within living memory, you remember having to ration your average grocery trip through months on end. You maybe even remember when your little sister had to prostitute herself to contribute to the family. You had to smuggle in cigarettes from other countries to trade for food because your currency is worthless. People lived through that, and you criticizing it as an old wound when many people had to live through that not too long ago. This criticism comes off as somewhat detached from the lived experience of many Germans. On the Dawes Plan, the Young's Plan, and the Lausanne Conference, I priorly complimented him for mentioning these. However, there are a few issues he overlooked when bringing them up. In no way did the actual German actually feel the benefits from these, aside those living in the Ruhr, because a lot of the benefits from the plans were heavily skewed. Beginning with the Dawes Plan, it sought to address Germany's failure to actually pay the debt. As, fun fact, taking away your colonies, resources, and industry makes it hard to pay back debts. So America laid down a few things in the Dawes Plan. 1. Germany was to pay about 1 billion marks within a year after the plan, with it increasing to about 2.5 billion marks by year 5. 2. France and Belgium were to stop occupying the Ruhr and taking its resources away. And finally, 3. Germany was given a recovery loan by the USA about 800 million marks. Despite the short-term benefits like decreasing unemployment and growing the industry, Germany became increasingly reliant on foreign loans to actually run its government functions, in turn ironically making Germany have more debt that it was dependent on other nations to pay off, which prompted the Young's Plan, which was the first plan that actually lowered the debt expected to be paid from 132 billion marks to 122 billion marks over a 59-year period, as well as a withdrawal of French troops from the Rhine, which seems really good for Germany. But remember, this is 1929. The Great Depression is around the corner, and as it hit, this plan was dropped and America wanted of its loans back, with neither the Dawes Plan or the Young's Plan loans being paid off until after World War II. Finally ending this with the Lausanne Conference, which was a meeting between several major European players at the time. The big talking point I believe historically was referring to was reducing Germany's debt about 90%, which historically misrepresents in his video as Germany's debts entirely being annulled, shown by the debt bag disappearing in his video, and describing the debt being cancelled entirely. However, what historically missed was the treaty never being ratified, as the USA never agreed to the terms, which meant that Germany still had an outrageous debt until Hitler's arrival, when he officially stopped paying the debts outright. However, I feel it is important to mention that at the start of the Great Depression, the Weimar Republic struggled to pay any meaningful amounts of debt anyways. But Hitler was justified in bringing up the treaty's economic struggle, as the wound was very well felt up until 1932.
It was only the Anglo-French warmongers who desired war and not peace.
Mr. Chamberlain, the English Prime Minister of the time, aka your Anglo opponent, who is sitting in a waiting room waiting for judgment himself, was literally the opposite of a warmonger with his appeasement policies. France had the same mindset, so this statement is yet again BS.
Now, the clip I played in front of you where Hitler claimed Britain and France are warmongers, to which historically dismissed it as bullshit, will be elaborated on later, when we begin discussing Chamberlain. Just keep this clip in your head for now. So, for Stalin, I struggled to figure out what to actually add here, because for the most part he did a well enough job for edutainment purposes. See, I'm not fond of criticisms that are actually like, the death count between 1937 and 38 wasn't actually 681,000, it was 386,000. Or criticisms like, he didn't just close down churches, he closed down mosques and synagogues too, because they're unproductive and don't actually add anything to the point. Instead, I'll be focusing on what he understood about the Soviet Constitution.
The new Soviet Constitution guarantees complete equality of rights for all citizens. Complete. Poles, Koreans, Finns, Germans, who were still Russian citizens, were being deported and placed under NKVD surveillance. The 1937 Polish operation alone killed over 100,000 people. Come on, Joseph, at least be socialistic and equalize it by killing everyone at that point, eh?
Finding the referenced 1936 speech in the video was nigh impossible. I found the Soviet Constitution, I found a 1937 speech, but I've actually yet to find the speech he was referring to in this video, which is why I'm linking all the sources I used in the video down below. Ignoring the Reddit humor of communism is when equality and death, this point here is kind of a non sequitur. The clip begins by pointing out discriminatory practices such as forced deportations. However, it then shifts to claims like he genocided Poles, as if that alone proves the absence of equality. This is where a lot of pop historians' moral posture. Sure, he did genocide, but it doesn't serve a purpose in bringing up here to complement your points. Furthermore, genocides in Soviet Russia were usually never precisely targeted, nor were they universally applied. Like in the order for the Polish genocide in the video, for example, order number 00485, it did not say kill Polish people. It gave a wide range of political enemies, spies, people with foreign connections, former resistance fighters, people related to former groups I just mentioned, etc. Problem is with tight Soviet deadlines, it was just a lot easier just to murder a bunch of people and call them spies or whatever the order asked them to kill. It's just another case of Soviet incompetence.
Elections will be universal, equal, and secret. I'm not even going to get into that one, to be honest. I think everyone knows that was complete BS as well.
Now, this might be a seemingly weird thing for me to comment on, because it's universally understood that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship, and thus, for most people's understandings, they had no elections. However, I would like to explore how the Soviet Union's elections actually worked, and what Stalin means by free, because I think it would help us to get into the head of the man. In Stalin's 1937 speeches surrounding the Soviet Constitution of 1936, he criticizes Western democracies as being fundamentally unfree. His argument was that capitalist societies were dominated by class interests, lobbying, and economic influence. In this view, even if people had technically the right to vote, wealthy interests and class pressures heavily influenced the political outcomes of elections. Now, to be fair, these are real issues in democracies. Lobbying, media influence, and economic pressure shape political systems. Stalin was not inventing these concerns out of nowhere. However, the problem lies in the solution he created for it. Soviet elections did exist, but they generally operated with a single approved candidate selected by the party. Voters could formally oppose the candidate, often by entering a private booth and altering or rejecting the ballot, while publicly submitting the ballot without modification signaled approval. On paper, this maintained the appearance of choice. In practice, however, there was an immense amount of social and political pressure surrounding the process. Walking into the private booth itself could draw suspicion because it implied opposition to the approved candidate. So while Stalin criticized liberal democracies for cohesion through wealth and influence, the Soviet system recreated the same political pressure through social conformity.
Try again.
And so you went on that plane to Munich. You met with Herr Hitler, allowed him to annex more, and came back home to London triumphantly the next day. Where you said, eyes again on the television please.
I want to say that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
So if it weren't for this next part, I wouldn't have made this video. You know, getting some numbers wrong about Stalin and overstating claims about Hitler is another thing. However, those sins are not as bad as how he framed Chamberlain, which upon my first viewing, I kid you not, I fell on my chair because of the sheer whiplash I got by hearing his takes. So, throughout the entire video, Chamberlain is shown to be a lazy, unintelligent, and incompetent character, being unable to perform simple tasks and often shown to be sleeping or out of the current moment. This is wrong. Chamberlain knew the war was inevitable and he did not in any way believe appeasement would work. Now, to be clear, Chamberlain absolutely did present himself publicly as a man of peace. After the Munich Agreement, he famously said, "I believe peace in our time." Chamberlain was a master of eloquence. He was really good at knowing what the people wanted and selling that to them to become prime minister. In his speeches, he was running for prime ministry. He had the exact same rhetoric in the speeches I've shown before you. The reason why running on peace was so successful was because most people in the UK didn't want war, especially in Scotland and Ulster. After all the scars World War I left in the minds of people at the time, it was a feeling not too similar from how Gen Z feels about war today. So it was an easy win for Chamberlain to run his campaign at the time as an office of peace. However, behind the scenes, Chamberlain was preparing war with Germany. So that clip before where Hitler claimed the UK was a warmonger isn't entirely unfounded. Chamberlain could be easily cased as a warmonger. In fact, the opposition party to Chamberlain, Labour, did so several times.
Daladier, who was the Prime Minister of France, all sat down in Munich to decide what to do about the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia where a few million ethnic Germans lived. Hitler claimed they were being mistreated and demanded the territory back since they lost it after World War I. Instead of standing up to him, you and the others just handed it over. You didn't even let the Czechoslovaks into the room while their country was being carved up. Everyone called it a peace deal, but in reality, Adolf made everyone in the room look, well, maybe aside from Mussolini, because they were basically pen pals, look like absolute fools.
People often criticize Chamberlain for not declaring war with France on Germany to defeat Hitler in the 1930s, but what people often forget when they criticize Chamberlain for not doing that is that the UK was not ready for war. The only branch at the time that was ready for war was His Majesty's Navy. The Army and the Air Force were not ready at the time for a large-scale European conflict like they were in 1914. Chamberlain needed time to actually build the military for an actual war with Germany. Chamberlain was actively preparing Britain for the possibility of war. Throughout the 1930s, Britain accelerated rearmament, particularly in the Air Force and air defense sectors. Even after Munich, Chamberlain openly stated, "For a long period now, we have been engaged in this country in a great program of rearmament, and disarmament on the part of this country can never be unilateral again." Now that you have the pretext from before, we can now answer the Czechoslovak question, Chamberlain being criticized for letting it happening. So, let's explore how capable the UK's military actually was during that time. Prior to 1938, the UK didn't have a modern radar system, they had poor anti-air, a severely outdated air force, and military spending was below 100 million British pounds. And the UK active military personnel didn't even number 250,000. However, in 1938, the UK had finally developed a decent radar system and anti-air, with a competent air force numbering about 15,000 aircraft. The UK Army had about 250,000 active personnel. Combined with its reserve, that is 750,000 troops total. This seems impressive, but the French had almost 1 million active personnel and 5 million reserve. Granted, France had a very underdeveloped air force at the time, but they were still pretty much prepared for war. Now, combined, the UK and France had a massive force. However, there are some major issues as to why they couldn't have invaded in 1938. The UK wasn't mobilized, the French Air Force wasn't up to code, and Germany could outproduce both of them. And, most importantly, the French military staff was very divisive and combative, and the UK military staff hasn't even fully drafted plans yet. There is little actual coordination between the two countries that could have led to Germany's downfall. So, what is Chamberlain to do? He could invade in 1938, but France and UK would have to finish their war plans in the middle of a war. Germany already had most of their war plans wrote up and could have easily scored a lot of early victories, though debating on this is outside the scope of this video. Chamberlain had to give up Czechoslovakia to buy more time.
Famously once said, "I have seen the Führer, and I believe he is a man who can be relied upon when he has given his word." I'm sorry, Neville, but this isn't a steak dinner night reservation deal you're looking over. We are talking about another world war here. You mentioned it yourself just now, that you never want another one again. But you failed, and not just one bit. Hitler broke every agreement handed to him, and every leader in Europe, with you at the helm, let him get away with it until it was too late. Within 6 years, about 85 million people were dead, and Europe was in ruins. But the consequences of your actions don't stop there. What followed was the Cold War, since the power vacuum in Europe allowed the USSR to become one of the main players. And the world was plagued by ideological wars for many years to come, where again, tens of millions of people died.
This is the most egregious part of the video. I'm not going to analyze Chamberlain's speech here because it's political peacemonger jargon, or demagogue jargon if you feel fancy to it. What I am instead going to point out is how ridiculous it is to blame Chamberlain for the Cold War to the US invasion of Afghanistan. Chamberlain, as stated prior, was powerless to stop Hitler, so he cannot be blamed for Hitler's conquest of Europe. Chamberlain did not play any role in the Cold War as he's long dead, and he did not contribute to the Soviets' rise. Most ridiculous of all, however, is blaming him for the US invasion of Afghanistan, which was caused by 9/11. When checking to see if anybody made a response to this video, I was properly miffed when I found out the only other guy who talked about this so far was some middle-aged, quote-unquote history teacher named Mr. Terry History, who didn't add anything of substance to the video, and just nodded his head along at blatant misinformation. Remember people, this guy's likely teaching your kids history. But hey, he even took a second to realize that Chamberlain was being too harshly treated in this video, which fair enough, he was. Now again, I'm not saying he deliberately used incorrect information, because that's silly. I genuinely think he was trying to make a moral position for the current pop historian meta. As any new pop historian, You have two options. The Nazis had genuine grievances, and they were intelligent but undermined by ambition, or the Nazis were stupid and lay heckin' racists and had no reason for existing. The two positions fluctuate throughout times, but the latter is the current meta, farming for YouTube's approval. However, the humiliation ritual is still the same. You must shit-talk Hitler and Chamberlain. Hopefully, historically takes some notes that I wrote in this video. This was my issue with historically, and thank you for paying me some mind.